Thank you, everybody. Welcome to Rethinking ROI and Manufacturing with Deloitte and Drishti. Today, our panelists will be discussing what the digital physical convergence that defines Industry 4.0 means for manufacturers, especially in terms of how innovation can help them respond effectively to global competition, innovation, and labor challenges. Before that can happen, there needs to be a fundamental shift in how manufacturers think about value capture and measurement, especially when it comes to investing in innovation. Making this shift represents a wholesale change in how manufacturers think and evaluate potential technology investments, measuring ROI through the lens of a holistic value creation instead of what it costs divided by how many jobs it will eliminate. Now, let's meet our panelists. Prasad, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and welcome to our audience. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever in the world you are. This topic of ROI is something that gets me excited as both as a technologist, as an entrepreneur, because as we take ideas into product into market, and into plants around the world, it's something that we've talked about, I've wrestled with for the last 5.5, 6 years. And I can't be more excited to have two colleagues who also wrestled with this problem from Deloitte joining me to sort of think this whole thing through and to sort of even craft possibly on the fly a framework that all of us can consider and work with. So what I thought I'd do is first have Steve Shepley introduce himself, and then I'll call in Brian for you to do the same. So Steve, floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. And good afternoon to everyone. My name is Steve Shepley. I am a principal at Deloitte Consulting. Been with the firm for about 24 years. My current role is to lead the aerospace and defense practice overall. However, my career has really been focused on driving digital transformation in the areas of engineering, operations, and supply chain. And it's really in those roles and experiences that brings me to this webinar today. And it's really what gets me excited, Prasad, about partnering with you and with Drishti, because even when I go back to my very first days out on the floor as an engineer, my job is trying to figure out what's going on. And you can see how this technology is able to do that at scale without a human doing it. But now we're getting to that point where how do you really optimize the role of the human on the shop floor? And this technology is a game changer. And that's what's really so exciting. And we're going to talk a lot about that ROI equation today.
I'm absolutely looking forward to that. And you know, you referenced the partnership between Drishti and Deloitte. That is, I believe, a game-changing move on our side and hopefully in yours and together for our clients. So Brian, maybe I can call on you now.
Absolutely. Thanks, Prasad. Thanks for having me today. I'm a senior manager with Deloitte Consulting. Been with Deloitte for about 10 years, specializing in factory transformation and smart factory work in our industrial sector. So I do a lot of work with our industrial equipment manufacturers, aerospace, shipbuilding, as well as some transportation companies as well.
And you started on the floor as well, didn't you?
Right. Prior to working in consulting, I spent almost a decade working on the floor as a manufacturing engineer and shop floor supervisor in aerospace. So I've essentially spent my whole career working in manufacturing in these particular applications in which people are doing activities, assembling parts, turning wrenches that have suffered from a dearth of data.
Awesome. And this is exactly what I think I was hoping to bring together here was this deep domain knowledge that's now being transformed into capturing value. And we'll talk about cost versus value as we go along, I'm hoping. So thank you both for taking the time this morning. And I just want to sort of launch off, right? So when I think about manufacturing, there are two key things that most manufacturers care about: quality and productivity. It just seems like if you could do the math around those two, the ROI story starts unfolding from there. Now, if you look back in history, the path has always been, the primary path has been, let's automate. Because we can automate, I can get rid of people, whatever, 5.6 people for every robot I put in, whatever the math people got. So I think of those models that have existed for the last 50 years as replacement models. Okay, I know I'm playing on a political play here, but the point remains that it is, I'm going to substitute a human being with a piece of equipment. And my ROI model is a very straightforward CapEx replacement model. I think what we're looking at is this new age where there's a second path for creating value, which is providing using digital technologies to provide insights for people to make better decisions, whether you're on the plant floor, I'm a line associate, or a plant manager. And so this is really an empowerment or augmentation model, not a replacement model. I think the very core problem I see in the market today is there's only one ROI model, and every manufacturer tries to take a round peg and fit in the square hole or the other way around because they don't have any other tools. And that's the core of what I want to tease out today. So Steve, maybe I can start with you.
Sure.
What are you seeing by way of digital technologies that the audience here should be aware of? And how do these technologies help manufacturers?
Yeah, so let me take piece one of that question first, Prasad. So if you stand out on any floor, there is an onslaught of new digital technologies coming. And I'm just going to hit a few categories. The first one is this big space of IoT platforms. And this is really just this ability to capture real-time sensor data, either straight off machines or from RFID and tags in your factory. So a lot of focus on just collecting and assembling signals. That's one big solution space. Another one is this whole world of projection systems, right? And these are things, for example, if a worker is building a product, you can actually project the three-dimensional as designed element on top of your physical world and make sure that as manufactured equals as designed. There's also projection systems that help workers pick the right product, right? It highlights what's the right rivet and or screw to pick with this specific product at this time. So that's that big world of projection systems. Another big space is non-contact inspection systems, right? So these more advanced solutions that paint products with white light or able to actually inspect the product much further than the human eye can to provide information back to that worker to finish their work either on time or to fix it downstream. There are a whole host of harmonic solutions, Wi-Fi sensors that listen to sound and try to figure out could sound actually detect if something's happening right or wrong. There is also vision systems, right, where either through images or real-time video, we're watching what's happening and we're trying to act on those. Then there's this whole host of other cyber physical systems, which are really things like cobots, exoskeletons, and really AI-powered robots that work in and around the human. So there are lots of options to really take, frankly, Prasad, what I think is the most sophisticated machine, the human, and really augment them in all sorts of ways. Now, when you ask how they benefit the manufacturer, this is where things are falling down. A lot of these times, people think of these technologies as point solutions. So all I'm going to measure my ROI is picking faster. Well, that's good, but that's only a first order benefit. What you actually need to do is to tie multiple solutions together to drive optimization and really that third, fourth, and fifth order benefit of the network effect. Because what I really want to do is dynamically schedule my factory and optimize constraints in real time, not only pick faster, right? That's just one component of the equation. So I would say the ROI is falling down because, again, we're applying this narrow viewpoint of just making one little thing better versus the full system.
It's interesting that notion of a narrow viewpoint. And is that because people find it easier to compute that? Or why are we doing that? What's going on?
I think it's the simplicity in the compute, as well as people don't think about the implementation the right way, right? What they're missing is the fact that if I were able to control multiple of these variables and deliver the right decision to that individual at speed, that's where the value happens. A lot of these, they collect all the data and they give you a report at the end of the shift. That's not particularly valuable. And you spend millions of dollars in an IoT system that gives you a better report. That's the missed value. It's too late. It's not delivered at the face of the rock to act at speed. And it's not taking all the variables into account to really tell me the right action or decision that I need to make. And that's where the miss.
So Brian, if I were to pick up where Steve left off and say, what's missing in this? What are the variables that we need to start adding to the mix? What's your take on those?
Absolutely. So the standard job displacement model, right, where a robot comes in and displaces a certain number of individuals, makes a couple of assumptions that leave a lot of value off the table, right? First is that all people and all factory workers are essentially equally productive and can do each job equally, which, as we know, having worked in factories is not the case, right? Typical factories will have anywhere from 20 to north of 100% turnover annually. And there's a lot of skills lost in those roles, regardless of how standard the work of any one job is made and how great the training programs are. It also kind of hurts the long-term growth of a company because those jobs, these factory jobs, are made so interchangeable that oftentimes they're seen as being constraining or non-strategic or mundane by some of the factory workers. Second, there's a lot of value lost in decision-making by the supervisory group, right? Essentially, in a world of manual manufacturing activity, right, where you don't have asset-intensive processes, there's a lot of guessing as to what's right to do next. What did we do today? What do we have the materials, the people, the skills to do now? That there's just not a lot of data left to make those decisions, and there's a lot of time wasted making those decisions and the wrong decisions made, which cost companies money. There's also value left on the table in terms of the upstream engineering impacts to manufacturing, right? For technologies like Drishti in particular can help companies justify engineering changes, right? There's a natural dynamic between operations leadership on the factory floor and design engineers who typically sit in another place on the right engineering changes or the right or how designs make manufacturing less efficient, right? With a tool like Drishti, it's easy to show them incontrovertible evidence that, hey, this design, this thing you made actually is causing us, X hours of additional labor per unit, things like that. And then on the flip side, there's value to be had in validating those engineering, tooling, fixturing changes as well. Because with technologies like Drishti coming out, there's clear evidence of the actual benefit yielded by that.
If I were to sort of pick up those 3-4 threads you laid out, I think what you're pushing for is a feedback loop.
Exactly, right. The manual manufacturing activity has just historically had no data, right? It's had at best someone stopping what they're doing, entering that they've completed an operation in an MES system, and there's a time lag there, and people don't always do it accurately, to be honest. Mm-hmm. If there's a single source of truth for what happened that is instantly accessible, it creates significant value there.
I think there's also one other maybe factor in this ROI formula that I want to add on is the notion of flexibility. Because I think while you add a lot of automation to get predictability and the repetitive nature solved, you also give up flexibility, right? And factories today do need to be able to change over faster, change what they're doing faster, adapt the production system. That's actually what humans are good at. Right. So really that loss of flexibility is oftentimes not in the cost of those automations, that you've actually taken that away. If you can actually armor the human to be more flexible and better at their jobs, akin or better than the robot itself, you can keep that flexibility, which is a ton of benefits to most manufacturers.
So you just said something interesting there. So when I framed up the problem originally, I said productivity and I said quality. Mm-hmm. I think I'm hearing you articulate a case for a third dimension, which is flexibility.
Yes.
And maybe that's what we are seeing right now as the world has transformed over the last 2.5 years, where we've given up flexibility and we've gone for long chain supply chains.
Yes.
Which are utterly rigid. And so I'm just curious how you might look at all the flexibility in this context.
Well, no, a couple different ways to think about flexibility. And, where I think about it is, you go back to that cost, right? Cost of changeover, cost of getting the new product to market. Missing those has huge impacts, right? And if I could very simply deploy technologies around my workers that allow them to be as efficient as that machine and produce the same level of quality, I could keep that flexibility, that turnover time, and all of that savings right there, right on the front lines of the business, which I think is huge, and make those decisions real time. I think there's another important point, and maybe this isn't as much a Prasad about flexibility, but you really need to change the definition of the worker jobs. I mean, I think, Brian, when you were talking about, they're all replaceable and they're all standard, there is this future of work where I think a lot of line workers love tech-infused jobs. And those are going to be the ones folks are going to drive to and want to come to in the future. So I think actually it's showing workers how you have longevity and how your job will be fun, tech infused, and that you will be growing and advancing over the course of your career versus just executing standard work that's down to the least common denominator. I think that portion of flexibility and keeping people in their jobs longer is another huge benefit, because cost of talent and labor is certainly something that's spiking right now.
So I want to pick that thread up. I think it's a fascinating thread you just touched on there, which is this notion of people in the loop, if I can call it that.
Yes.
So before we go there, I was looking at the results that came off the survey, and it seems like, no surprise, 46% believe that shooting for productivity. But what caught my attention was this contention among quality, operations disruption, and time to market, that as the three follow-up sort of leaders at 13% each. So I think this is pointing out in the direction of what you just said, which is this notion of flexibility. And I think you touched on this idea of speed of decision also along the way, as the two of you were talking about it. So I want to tease these two out as we go along here. And so I want to come back to where you were at, which is this notion of people in the loop, of skills, of making these jobs exciting, because you're actually working with something utterly new on the line. As a line associate, if I can see data, if I can run experiments on the ground, move my toolbox from the left to the right, and I can prove that I can shave half a second off quantitatively, I can start capturing the creativity of every single person on the factory floor, not just the industrial engineer.
Yes.
Right.
And it's that, I think, Prasad, where you're going, and this is a really important thing, is line workers love to win. It's really hard for them to demonstrate to leadership how they win every day with those small course corrections, right, that make them champions every single day. But when you layer a tool like Drishti on top of the environment that can follow sequence, method, cycle, process, you can start seeing those minute adjustments that each worker makes to try to do their job better. You start being able to track that data that we've been totally blind to for decades and know those benefits, right? In each step, you'll also know when it was a bad benefit, right? I moved the work box and I actually lost time. I moved the work box and I gained time. Now I can quickly find the next benefit on top of that one. And I can actually recognize individuals real time for doing the best performance on that work step or that cycle, and am I a champion, for that day? Am I a champion across everything we've ever built in the history, so on and so forth. Like being able to recognize those brilliant outliers and drive that feedback to humans, that reward and talent model is huge, and it can make jobs far more fun.
Right.
I think that's a huge important point.
And along those lines, you can also, using tools like Drishti, identify your outliers in a positive way, right? So instead of compressing all of your operators in a given operation, like essentially compressing all their times to your work standard, you can identify the people actually doing it better and then create that as the work standard. So you move all of your operators to the left instead of compressing, the actual labor required to the mean, if you will.
So if I tie two concepts that you're talking about here, one is the lean process, leaning out and getting the kind of efficiency you're talking about, Brian, and time on the other hand. We all talk about continuous improvement. And really what we're talking about here possibly is the compression of continuous improvement. So in other words, instead of doing this once a year, we're now actually talking about, like an e-commerce website, doing it every single rotation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like a way to think about this problem?
Prasad, I think that's exactly right. That no longer is continuous improvement something that happens once a month, or maybe when I do a Kaizen event. It's happening every second of every day. I'm actually driving continuous improvement into the hands of that line worker. I mean, it's like playing Moneyball right there at the face of the line, because that individual is making those small tweaks and enhancements and those improvements every step of the way. And if they make a negative one, they can correct it very quickly and jump back to the last standard. And that ability, and again, if you think about what Moneyball did, is like every single decision was about scoring another run, right? That's what you're doing with this constant delivery of information down to the line worker, is getting that next small percentage of productivity or quality improvements every day, right? And driving that over a full network benefits over time.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you frame that, because I asked my colleagues at Toyota, when you go to your suppliers, how do you know who is really being lean, who's following TPS and who's not? And they laid out for me an interesting suggestion. They said, go to standardized work and ask them who defined standardized work. And I said, okay, so what are my choices? And he said, well, one is the industrial engineer. And the second, the more interesting option, is the line associate with the industrial engineer. Because to your point, Steve, the line associate knows the nuances of the job far better than everybody else and can make those small changes quicker and better and more meaningfully than the industrial engineer. I've been on the line. I look at what people are doing. It seems simple, but when I actually do the job, it's not as simple as it seems.
Exactly right.
So the person, the artist on the floor is the person who actually is best positioned.
Mm-hmm.
Good. So I think what we're layering on top of this ROI framework, in addition, we started with productivity and quality. We added flexibility to that.
Mm-hmm.
We then layered on top of that people and giving them the tools to make decisions quicker. And then the fifth thing we've added so far is time to decision.
Yep.
Right? So that's, I think, the shifting framework that we're evolving here, at least in my mind. Now, I want to sort of take this. Sorry, go ahead. You're going to say something.
No, I was going to ask, which of those dimensions covers the point that Brian mentioned earlier, which is the multifunctional benefits, right? When you think about, you talked about that design change,
Yep.
right? And the ability for a feedback loop rapidly from a design change to the impact on manufacturing, that's huge. And that's information the engineers don't have when they think about the next design. Think now about the material handling individual that's trying to get right material there at the right time. How do they know exactly their impact in that whole equation of when they deliver the material, how they stage the material, where they place the material? Think of all these other multi-dimensional functions that start benefiting from these real-time continuous improvements. That absolutely has to be a dimension that's lost. So it cannot get lost in our ROI model.
Yeah. So let's think about it this way, right? So we've got use cases, and we typically do A plus B plus C plus D is the cumulative value.
Right.
I think what you're laying out here is saying that if I get improved productivity and or quality, there's a warranty benefit that sits on top of this.
Yes.
Right? And or a human HR training benefit that sits on top of this, or Brian's example of I can feed the data back to the engineer, and suddenly my design for manufacturing is far more focused and efficient because the two parties are actually on solving a common problem as opposed to a perceived problem.
Right. Even your example of training, let's not have that lost, because with a tool like Drishti, you don't do broad-based training. You can find out exactly where the anomaly and the outlier is down at the step and the task level. And I can figure out the 3 workers I need to train, not the 15. Not the general training, the specific training. We are firing rifle shots versus these broad applications. It all saves time. And that time is cost.
And I've had to riff off of that idea. If there is a problem, and I can go back and identify Prasad on the line caused a problem, that means my warranty window suddenly shrank.
Yes.
Right? So suddenly the CFO doesn't have to worry about a recall from date A to date B. It's date A to B, but when Prasad was in that rotation on that station, it's not even a blind recall, right? So it is that rifle shot that is just changing the economics of what you're talking about.
Exactly right.
And even more than that, you can pull up the video and the data from that particular operation and verify if Prasad caused the defect on this unit versus other units, right? So you can not only narrow it to a much smaller time frame, but to particular serial numbers of units as well, using Drishti.
Yep. So it's interesting. When I buy a car or I buy anything in my house, I sort of look at a multi-factor analysis to see, okay, how much fuel, should I buy electric or should I buy internal combustion? Am I looking for a luxury, not this, that, big, small? Can I park the car easily when I drive into downtown? Yet when it seems like the buyers, so there are 3 protagonists. There's the plant floor, the operations person, the buyer, and the plant manager who signs off on the check. So I'm thinking about it from the buyer's perspective now, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of us are buyers in our normal lives. Why is it that the buyer in this situation is not as sort of enlightened, if I can put it that negatively? Why is it that they just simply look at replacement?
Sure. I think kind of the replacement ROI model is the most accessible model for new technologies and factories often, right? It doesn't require any expertise in manufacturing to understand that, if you remove a certain headcount from your plant, you get a certain financial benefit. It relies on, somewhat straightforward data using, full-time equivalent costs and things like that. But it's not nuanced either, right? A nuanced view of value for new technologies would capture both, cost reduction, but also the optionality to move into additional markets, right? Potential upside for increased productivity. The current mindset is really kind of a legacy mindset that, maybe lower risk if you can eliminate headcount, but it doesn't capture the upside either, right? Becoming more productive or being able to produce new and different kinds of products as well.
Yeah. I think there's also this challenge, Brian, that people conceptually understand the replacement model, because when there used to be workers and I come in the next day and now the machine is there, I feel like I can see those benefits immediately. When you're leaving a production environment alone and wrapping the digital technologies around it, driving those smaller improvements in productivity, it's just harder to see that change and know it's been fully implemented and fully adopted. So there's always, I feel like, just this simplistic model we fall back on, right? Versus how do we really think of the benefits of arming the most fantastic machine in the world, which is the human, with all of these technologies around them to make them better and better and better, because they will beat a machine when you put these technologies around them. And that largely is proven, over time.
Right. There's also a lot of factories have a much higher willingness to invest in capital assets, right? Machines, material conveyance equipment, things like that. But those are large, tangible, physical items typically, right? That I think there's a bit of reluctance in digital assets investment, as well as, like you said, Steve, in people, right? That can have similar impacts on productivity, but just aren't quite the monuments on the shop floor that some other items are.
And there is a decision control point there, because to replace a machine, I just need the factory to agree. If I'm going to implement a digital technology, I need IT on board, right? I need the plant manager on board. I got to deal with OT networks, IT networks. I also then have to think about how you train and deploy the technology and get adopted. So it's you really have to think about that partnership model when you go after digital technologies versus kind of the simple, one function benefit model.
So I'd layer SaaS in the middle of all of that, right? They used to a one-time buy, and now you suddenly say you're going to be paying over time, and now suddenly this model, what happens to the model is a whole different play there.
It totally changes again right there, because the cost of ownership in a SaaS model is far lower.
And I think that's part of the calculus. It's one big payment up front that you depreciate over 5 years, and then you hope you get a freebie after that. This is a lower amount, higher value at that point in time. So it sounds like what you're suggesting here is not a buyer problem. This is a chief procurement officer level question, because it touches all of those functions that both of you just described.
Mm-hmm.
So it almost feels like I should be calling on the chief procurement officer even as we're working a deal, because the sooner the procurement officer with his or her strategic sense of where the business needs to go steps in, the easier it is for the procurement team to cut a deal.
Right. And I'm actually attesting, you really want a committee involved. So all those benefacting parties we've talked about, engineering, HR, IE, ME, the direct labor on the floor, the supervisors, they all have to be on board with this benefit model and what's going to happen. And I think you'll quickly realize these technologies really optimize all of those versus any one. And that chief procurement officer has to understand where are all those benefits and how is that full team on board with this transformation. That's really where the success.
But then for my sales, putting on my sales cap, a move in that direction just extends the buying cycle or the selling cycle from my perspective. How does one sort of navigate those two, where you need the buying team, correct, but you also want a decision made and you want things to move fast?
Yeah, and this is frankly a struggle. I think anyone could sneak out onto a manufacturing floor and sell the small use case, which is that example of just get the guy to pick a little bit faster. Let's just get him to do that. And I think that's the small value equation. I think if you go a little bit slower you get more of these parties involved and you bring in these other dimensions of ROI that we've spoken about, then you start to realize, well, wait a second, I don't want to just deploy this on one part of my production line and then never get to the rest. Because I've seen a million great digital technologies implemented on one work cell and they never went anywhere. It's because they went too narrow with this value. You're better off to go a little slower, get all of the work cells on board, all of the benefactoring functions, and do one larger transformation with a big benefit. That is actually what the real equation is here we're optimizing. I want to dynamically schedule my factory on real-time constraints and performance. That's $100 million in value versus a few thousand of just getting that guy to pick faster.
Yeah, we have one of the members of the audience, Manuel, asking this question. He's saying this is the biggest catch. We're trying to bring the service departments in when they're not used to participating in the decision-making.
Right.
Is I think the challenge he's calling out.
Yes.
Right. It needs to be akin to a total cost of ownership model, right? That it can't be kind of a direct initial cost, right? It has to have value over, across all the functions impacted. And this combined approach where you get many different groups together also helps in adoption, right? As anyone who's tried to change things on the shop floor can attest, right? Pilots are easy, right? But sustained results are much harder, right? And the more people you get involved from the onset in a new technology, in a new process, in a new way of doing things, and make it integral to the daily activities of multiple different groups within a factory and even outside the factory, the much more likely it is to be sustained.
Brian, you just touched on two things here, which is if I was selling a robot, it's a neat piece of cake because everybody's used to buying it today, right? There's this very set pattern, you hit a particular number and boom, you got the deal and off you go. But when I take my mind back to 20 years ago when I was at GM, where one of my colleagues was actually shipped off to be part of worldwide purchasing is what we called it back at GM. My bosses shipped him off to worldwide purchasing because they realized that it's the robotics team that actually had to help purchasing frame up that process to make it simpler for everybody else downstream. So I think what we're really saying is this thread that we're kicking around here, which is a framework, is probably what we got to sort of suss out a little bit collectively as a manufacturing community, and then take it back to our procurement brethren and say, guys, here's a new way, here's a different way, because the technologies are newer. We got all of us have to shift our minds and start thinking differently. So I think what I'm hearing you say. I couldn't agree more. I want to pick up a parallel thread that you just mentioned there, which is process change, right? So technologies by themselves will not do anything. We talked about it. You got to improve the speed of decision. You got to empower the guy on the floor. Now that's a cost that I often don't see in any of these ROI models my customers are pushing at me. It's like there's an investment that they need to make beyond just for a Drishti-like technology or any digital technology. There's a human investment that they need to make. Do you see them thinking that way, or is no? I've already got the person. It's a sort of a loss leader at one level. Because the salaries have spoken for.
Well, I think where you're going is maybe what I often see is the cost of taking no action is huge, but no one ever actually looks at that monstrous cost. Right. But when you then, and because I've seen it with Drishti, you actually bring in this real-time AI. So now the humans know when the action they've taken is beneficial and to keep doing it. And they know when another action was negative and they stop doing it. That benefit then flows directly to the bottom line in productivity. And then you can measure and give ribbons because you see that worker is a champion out there hitting unbelievable standards and compressions and standards you thought were unbelievable. So then they get more excited about doing more. I mean, that's the piece of the equation that is left to the side every time, is that cost of no action and the speed at how fast you implement that decision.
Interesting. So it almost boiling down then to, we've got to go to the plant manager, the guy who signs the check.
Yep.
And there's some sort of probably an education for him and his leadership team. So as an example, I've heard several of my customers say, I get it. I intuitively see the value. I've been on the floor. It's a complete no-brainer. and then turns around and says, but my biggest challenge is to get my controller to think differently. So this notion of thinking differently across the organization is sort of what I want to start digging into a little bit more. How do we get people to recognize a shift, the value from the shift, and not think cost, but value? Because I think that's another huge paradigm shift. As manufacturers, we think of cost. And as a software guy, I think of value. And really, is how do you bring those two worlds together? Educate the decision-making committee that Brian spoke about, and shifting them from cost to value.
Right. I think any investment decision, right, needs to be made by a committee, right? Like we've discussed, but it needs to include both upside and downside and risk, right? A typical cost-based approach assumes downside only, right? Like what's the cost of doing this, right? And how much money do we save? And it assumes a completely static business environment in which you make these same products with the same demand, right? So it doesn't include any business risk in it either. But if you have an equation that includes both what you could gain, right? Could you do this better? Could you capture more market share? How could you reduce your cost? As well as what's the risk mitigated to your business? You're likely to get a much more holistic answer to your investment request.
So it's this notion of holistic thinking that I think what you're suggesting is the focus of the rethink. Correct. I'm going to add a dimension to that, which I think I heard Steve talking about along the way, which is this one size does not fit all approach, the Moneyball story that Steve was telling, right?
Yep.
Because if you think about Moneyball and you think about human beings, we all have skills and strengths and weaknesses. And what Moneyball really did, at least for me, was it took players with certain skills and put them in the right places, and it measured them for the skill required for that role on the team.
That's right.
And I'm just wondering if you could dig in for a second into Moneyball for manufacturing and the impact on the ROI. So I'll throw out an example to spur the conversation here. I think, Brian, you mentioned the 10 to 20% annual attrition. I've heard numbers as high as 120%. Scary, but that's what it is. And I've also heard numbers like 10% daily absenteeism. So I'm taking the analogy here of I need to put a team together, a baseball team together, to put them on the field, and some of my players haven't shown up this morning. How do I figure out the 10 people I've got, and how do I create a rotation program that doesn't demand unnatural acts of God from them, but just takes their natural skills and deploys them, right? And my thesis is that Moneyball style, if I take Prasad, who's skilled at stations 1, 3, and 8, and those are my 3 rotations for the day, and Brian skilled at other things, you suddenly can take people and put them in the right spots. You'll get a lift in productivity that we've probably not thought about.
Yes.
Am I dreaming stuff up with good smoke here, or?
No, I actually think you're spot on. I mean, let's go back. I mean, in Moneyball, the whole transition was the old talent scouts versus the new way to scout talent. Think of a plant manager, right? The day before, or maybe the night before a shift starts, they create a schedule that has a whole bunch of assumptions in it. I go out on the manufacturing floor, that schedule is dead 1 minute into the shift because 5 people didn't show up, some material's not available, and a machine is down. And then everybody has to wait for a lot of time to figure out, okay, what's the next best thing for me to do? Because I don't actually know how the whole system works. Imagine if you had a vision system that exactly knew who was there because it's real time, what material was available, what machines, and it could start directing the people to get to the right work at the right time when the issues happen at the face of the rock. That's that network effect, that second and third order benefit to coordinating all of the resources in the factory that has huge benefits. And those are totally left out when you think about some of these point solutions or how you valued any type of digital technology. It is truly playing Moneyball. And then, by the way, it's not just the first change you make. There's another change required 10 minutes later, and another 10 minutes later, and another 10 minutes. It's that notion of continuous improvement happening real time versus in some periodic event that's too late. Right? That's where all that value is.
Yep. Well, who's the general? I can't remember who said that the minute the war starts, my plan got thrown out of the window. It's the same thing,
Yes,
right?
exact same thing, right? Those, the person who thought the schedule would survive the first minute of production, that leader's dead in the future with these types of technologies.
Correct. And that I think is truly the fascinating change that's in play right now. I want to start wrapping up a little bit here and see. I actually took a quick pass at sketching a few things out here. So maybe Jeremy, I think you were able to paste that in. I know it's incomplete based on everything we discussed, but could you please bring that diagram up?
Yes, sir. 1 second.
We did a quick hack, so please, the audience, bear with my bad writing. And it's incomplete because I think I was trying to take the stuff together and put it. So I think what I heard was there's use cases that are additive.
Mm-hmm.
There are use cases, then these use cases actually have a distributive function over product engineering, warranty, HR, training, all of those things we talked about. We talked about this people as a central part of this flow and this notion of context and time to action. And I think we've said that's the exponential value that can be created. This notion of lean running every second of the day as opposed to once a year or once a month.
Correct. And running over the full factory, not just one spot in a factory. All of those are the exponentials that get lost.
Got it. So essentially the notion of manufacturing being a system as opposed to being a single station play.
Correct.
How does one do the math of this? I'm just trying to think of a spreadsheet at the back of my mind. And I'm going over to meet a CFO on the other side because we've agreed it's a CXO level that's got to be pitched. This is not a guy who's making a decision on the floor here. This has got to be a bigger deal. Any thoughts on how we could frame that up for a CFO?
My thought is you've got I think all the dimensions are in here. We do have to make it simple for the CFO to understand. And the way I might think about it is you might want to build these up, piece by piece to first talk about the direct benefit of the technology deployed to an individual work center. Then you want to think about that benefit as it scales across the factory, and how does that add on top of that first order benefit? Mm-hmm. Then you want to go beyond just the direct functions into all the support functions to add those pieces on. So I feel you have to create kind of this almost waterfall type picture of the sources and the buckets of value. What you're going to quickly realize is that first one that most people rely on is probably the smallest. And it's really the network effects, the multifunctional effects, and then the speed of decision making and the exponentials that really are where all the money are saved. And then suddenly that CFO is going to say, wait, don't go do a pilot in one work center, pilot the entire factory. Because now we're going after a bigger equation and a bigger benefit. Because once I prove out that full benefit at that factory, now I can replicate that template at all 70 of my factories. Right? And I have a real business case behind it.
So that's a complete paradigm shift in thinking of how you validate new technologies. Right? Because everybody else wants to say, in fact, I remember when we started, the invitation would be to go to essentially to their lab. And I having lived in the labs myself, I would just refuse to do that. I said, I'm not going to do it. Either you put me in the real world or I'm not, I'll come back to you later on.
Right.
Right. So now what you're laying out is a bolder plan here, which is not even on one line in the plan. You put me across a large part of the plan. So you could, the network effect, that exponential value becomes clear to all.
Right. The value of synchronization is so large in a factory, and it's missed almost every single time. And I couldn't agree more.
Got it. So this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to now open this up and bring in the audience into the into the flow here. So Jeremy, Aaron, if you can help me, you've been tracking that. Could you let me know?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick comment on the last discussion that you folks were having about the potential spreadsheet. Manuel says maybe using an OEE graph and showing the OLE multiplication. What are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting concept. What I love about OEE, it's kind of this unitless dimension where you multiply really the benefits of availability, quality, and speed, right, all together to kind of measure the performance of that cell. We almost need to kind of come up with more buckets of value as you stretch that out to kind of agree on what that total target is, right? I do think the OEE concept is a great one because it does allow you to put together multiple kind of multi-dimensions of value into one simple equation and measurement. It is an interesting.
I would submit, Brian, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with what Steve said, right? Using OEE as a comprehensive measure works great in especially process industries. But there's certainly an opportunity to enhance it with kind of some other.
So I'll give you my take on that. I think the E in the OEE is all about equipment.
Yes, it's very equipment focused. If you're human driven, OEE is a hard metric to use. That's why I was saying it's a good concept, but it's inadequate.
So I think, Manuel, at least sitting where I am and looking at all of this, there is, I don't know, OPE, if I can make up such a term, overall people or personnel efficiency is what we are talking about. This is the extension to the OEE model that we may want to consider, which has some of the ramifications, that little picture that I sketched out a few minutes ago.
All right, we have a few other questions here. So Daniel asks, in the context of flexibility and people, how much is the passion for work or motivation to achieve the results daily in the ROI? And he's thinking maybe a percentage.
Well, I would attest that the job satisfaction piece and how arming humans with these technologies, I feel like that is a lost factor in the measure. I might look at something else like your attrition rates and the cost of attrition and the amount of money it takes to identify a worker, hire them, train them, and get them at the quality of the worker you just lost is not just 1 or 2 percentage points. I mean, it could be 5, 10, 15, 20%. Because if you can wrap technology around that worker, satisfy them more with their job, allow them to play Moneyball every day and own the outcomes and be a champion, they will stay longer. They will create better jobs, right? They will work better with those around them because they know the network effect versus individual benefits. I attest that has a huge value. And I think it cannot get lost in this equation.
So you think it's not 1 or 2%? This is 10, 20%.
I think it's 10 or 20%. I think in today's labor market, it's going to keep going up.
Got it. I think I'm in agreement with you. The 1 or 2 sounded a little low to me, Daniel.
So there is actually a follow-up question from another attendee that I think is interesting too, speaking about the line worker's job being more attractive and talking about the overlooked cost of attrition, but how do we get more people in the organization and even across the industry to realize this and stop seeing these line roles as more interchangeable?
Sure. So using tools like Drishti, right, you can actually quantify what the dip in productivity is after you have a new person come online and be performing an operation, right? You have a baseline set of information that, from date X to date Y, this operator produced this many units. From date Y to Z, when you had a new operator come on, there was a 30% dip in productivity, right? That decreases over time as the individual becomes more comfortable with the operation, but there's a quantifiable, inarguable dip. You can also quantify the training cost, right? Because when you have new operators come on, there's not only a period of time in which they're unproductive as they're learning the operation, but it also requires a team leader, a more senior operator, a supervisor, an industrial engineer to take time away from what they're doing and actually train that individual. That has cost to the organization as well, right? So I think a data-based approach to presenting these arguments to people within the factory, but not on the shop floor, is the best way to approach this.
Yeah, and Daniel, sitting in a startup, I can attest to the fact that passion matters deeply.
Yes.
We don't work 40-hour days in a startup. We work crazy hours. We sort of it's because we believe in what we do. There's a passion behind it, and I can tell you that the output of a startup team is significantly higher because of passion. And while you're absolutely, Brian, we can quantify it, I just think there's this absolutely uncountable notion called passion that leads to multiplier results.
So we have another question here.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
No, I was just going to add to the point of how do we get the industry to change. I do think we have to paint this more bold picture of what the AI-enabled worker looks like and can do. Because I think that's not the way we think. We just think of the human as someone who does standard tasks. That's not the comparison point we're making anymore. The most fantastic machine in the world is the human powered with the AI, and the outcomes they can drive are fantastic. And I don't think people realize that. And that hands down, a human augmented with these technologies will likely beat a robot over time. I've been into a million factories where I walk in and I see a giant auto driller not being utilized. And I try to understand why. And they're like, well, we thought that equipment was the savior, but then the product changed and I couldn't use it anymore. So now it's a monument off to the side that nobody's using, and my process is over here driven by humans, right? They just didn't ever think about the value of that flexibility. Now the human can adapt and change so quickly and so much faster than the static, fully automated production system. And I think a lot of companies are seeing that some of their investments in that robotics hasn't yielded the benefits that they thought.
So that actually begs a question, if I can put it in front of you folks, which is, when I craft my 401k portfolio, I'm doing, following efficiency frontier theory, which is risk reward optimization. So is there some sort of a similar model for choosing automation and people so that at the end of the day, the factory is effectively producing high quality and is flexible? The three things we thought we'd hang our hats on.
I think that would be, I would certainly look at that as a valuation model, and I would certainly look at what is the balance between physical investment in capital versus investment in technologies to augment humans. And you might argue those either balancing that equation or slanting slightly towards leveraging the talent you've got in a more effective way might actually be the highest return model, right? And maybe you start selecting your portfolio for those companies that are more balanced or actually leaning towards human optimization versus physical automation optimization.
That's completely counterintuitive, isn't it? It goes against
totally.
100 years here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The only caveat I'd say to that is, if you have if you have reasonable confidence that you have a completely stable product base, or you have like a safety issues in your manufacturing operations, right? Automation can be very, very beneficial, but it certainly takes that flexibility out. If you have any reasonable inclination that your business is going to change, whether it's from products, markets you serve, the people-based flexibility is certainly where most companies are.
Yeah. So what you're basically saying is you got long-run products, automation makes sense. If you got dynamic products, it probably doesn't make sense. And then you got this middle characteristic in the middle where Apple has to make iPhones, a billion iPhones in 3 months and then go sell them for the rest of the 9 months, right? So you got these pockets, and really what you're saying is you got to look at the kind of manufacturing you're in, and then the optimization, the people-human optimization, machine optimization, Steve, you talked about, has to be matched up to that.
I still will push that even if I'm manufacturing the same product over and over again for 20 years, like an aircraft manufacturer, the value of the human doing constant and continuous improvement on every one of those jobs and standards over time still might be more beneficial than just putting one machine in that's going to stay exactly the same over a 20-year period. I still think there's flexibility in there we're missing in the value of that equation.
I couldn't disagree with you on that at all. In fact, I vehemently reach out and give you a hug because of that. Okay, Erin, what's next?
Yeah, so just a couple more quick questions. This next one is related to what you've been discussing. So just an add-on, understanding that it's a difficult answer and definitely a case by case. Is there any approximation regarding the ratio between investments made from the plant and the revenue absorbed by using such a system?
So whoever asked the question, to frame it, are you suggesting that should I be thinking about 10% of the revenue of the plant being invested in new technology? Is that what you have in mind?
I think that's the right, yep, I think that's the framework.
There's almost like a company where you say, how much of my revenue should I put into sales and marketing, right? It's the same framework. Can you give me some accounting multiples to work with? It's, I think, what I'm hearing him ask.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I also think there's this simplistic mindset, where you always look at, how do I deal with new CapEx and depreciation? And people kind of tend to say, well, just keep that constant, investment model and against that factor. I mean, I would attest you probably need to shift a portion of your investment over, although these digital technologies are cheaper and can get implemented far faster than capital. And I think that's another piece that we've forgotten in here, is that by the time you buy the machine, manufacture the machine, install it, qualify it, get it in synchronization with everything else, there's huge cost to all that people typically ignore. A lot of these digital technologies, in the example here with Drishti, you can hang a camera, in a handful of cycles, start providing initial insights real time to a user, and in 30 or 40 cycles, start seeing benefits, and in 100 cycles, have constant continuous improvement. Like that, to me, would suggest, you might actually want to up your investments in the digital technologies, and they might not even be 10% or 20%. It might be less than your CapEx and depreciation levels, but you can actually get more benefits from them. I'm struggling to figure out what that perfect percentage is. I'm not sure I know that offhand.
But I think you laid out the ground. This idea of time to value.
Yes.
Is, I think, the critical idea that, at GM, we used to take a plant down for 6 months, maybe a year, to retool the entire line to build a new product. $1 billion plant down for 6 months to 12 months.
Yep.
As opposed to, if I can do that on the fly, it's a whole different place.
It's a whole different thing. You lost none of that productivity. The plant never shut down. Right, maybe individual work centers have different break-in points, but like that ability to keep it running, but flexibly and constantly change into those new products, huge value.
Totally.
So we have one more question. I know we're at the top of the hour, but let's squeeze this one in if we have another minute. This is from Daniel. He says, all continuous improvement is important, but needs to be part of manufacturing strategy, which needs to be led by the senior leadership team. How do you see this? Because he lives in a model of plant strategy, which needs to be aligned with the business. What's your opinion on this?
I definitively agree that this has to be part of your overall manufacturing strategy. And I say that going back to maybe one of my original points, that the network effect and the exponential effects are so large that if you don't go after those, which requires a full manufacturing strategy and a kind of a multifunctional approach to the way you deploy these, you really minimize the value equation. And whether you either go to a plant level or an individual work cell level, those are just not big enough to get the full benefits. So I do agree, you've got to have at the manufacturing strategy level, what is your investment plan to arm humans with the right technology around them to optimize their jobs? You need a strategy behind that and a plan. And then you've got to float that down to every factory and every build area and every work center and every human. From that mindset, that's where the value is. So I couldn't agree more. It's got to be at that level.
All right. Hey, we are at time. Thank you very much to our panelists and the attendees for joining. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you for the fantastic questions as well. And Steve and Brian, my thanks to you.
Yes, thank you for letting us be a part. This was exciting. This is going to be a fun journey.